Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, William Green Tevault, a man of many firsts, including first-rate Scallywag, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Leah Pastizo, Digital Services Specialist. This program is being recorded. Please mute your microphone and turn off your camera to ensure quality recording. There will be a time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Latgawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, as well as of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and Modoc Nation, who were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous peoples whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. And now I'll hand it over to Larry.
Good morning. On behalf of the Southern Oregon Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you all to our Windows in Time presentation. We have a very fine speaker today and one of the most knowledgeable women or men of Southern Oregon history, particularly around Jacksonville, that you'll find. She's written innumerable items on Jacksonville and is the president of Jacksonville, Historic Jacksonville, Inc. Got to get that right. She's also the former publisher of the Jacksonville Review and the vice president of the Southern Oregon Historical Society. Our talk today is on William Green Tevault, a man of many firsts. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Carolyn Kingsnorth. Thank you.
All right. Well, let me get my slides going. Prior to 1859, individuals seeking the opportunity, riches, and promise of the Oregon Territory were literally leaving the United States. They were also leaving behind their former lives, providing them with a chance to reinvent themselves. This reinventing process might even include a name change, and it appears to have occurred often enough to be captured in song lyrics. Oh, what was your name in the States? Was it Johnson or Thompson or Bates? Did you murder your wife? Did you fly for your life? Say, what was your name in the States? One such prominent early Jacksonville resident who did this a number of times and changed or at least altered his name several times was William Green Tevault. If you have visited Jacksonville's Pioneer Cemetery, you may have noticed his grave. It's next to the Interpretive Center and resembles an open book. However, Tevault's life was anything but open. William Green Tevault, as he was Teevault, as he was originally named, was born in 1806. He was supposedly born in Davidson, Tennessee, although family lore also places his birth in mid-Atlantic en route for his parents were immigrating from France, in Charleston, South Carolina, where their boat landed. But then other records show his father being born in Virginia. So this is in the category of who knows. Especially since Tevault came from an unconventional family, according to a descendant. Family records showed individuals with a continuing series. I can't see my notes. Sorry. Continuing series of marriages without any deaths or divorces. Assault and battery charges, and a proven charge of adultery. Tevault was more respectable, or at least initially. In fact, he showed much promise. By age 23, he was already involved in politics. He served in the Indiana legislature and as county tax collector. And that same year, he married Rhoda Boone Burns, who claimed to be the granddaughter of Kentucky's famous pioneer Daniel Boone. If true, it would have definitely been a step up the social ladder. However, it appears that Rhoda may have done some inventing of her own. According to the Boone Family Society, she was not related to Daniel Boone. In 1814, we find that Teevault, T-E, as he was now spelling his name, was living in Scotia Pope County, Arkansas, where he was practicing law. A year later, he's secretary of the Arkansas Territory's Legislative Council, colonel commandant of the local militia, and the justice of the peace for Pope County. Soon after, he's elected prosecuting attorney for the territory's 5th Judicial District. Perhaps success went to Teevault's head, or perhaps the acorn does not fall far from the tree. In October of 1837, he's charged with trying to indulge on a 13-year-old gal. Excuse me. 2 weeks later, he's arrested and jailed for murder. Claiming he would not receive a fair trial in Polk County, he petitioned for a change of jurisdiction. After being transferred to Lewisburg, he succeeded in escaping jail. The Little Rock Times and Advocate reported in February of 1838, William G.H. Teevault, late attorney of the state in this district, who stands charged with murder in Polk County, and is also indicted there for an attempt to commit rape or sodomy, some days since escaped from the Lewisburg jail. The attorney who defended him, and who also is residing up the country, i.e. in jail, for some similar indecencies, as it is said, was a few days since shot through the suburbs of his unmentionables. Wound said not to be mortal, although a transformation to the neutered gender may be seriously apprehended. Teevault returned to Indiana, where he resumed his practice of law and his role as upstanding member of the community. Rhoda, the good wife, stood by his side. Teevault again ran for local office, but perhaps his past caught up with him. In 1845, he walked away from his Indiana landholdings and headed for Oregon as part of a 300-person wagon train. At Fort Boise, they joined up with the Stephen Meek group, Meek promised a shortcut to Oregon, even though he had never actually traveled the route. The trek proved long and arduous. When threatened with a necktie party, Meek vamoosed. Teevault then led the train the last 5 days into the Dales, arriving in a month and a half behind those who took the slow route. But Teevault could now claim to have captained a wagon train. Arriving in the Dales after the torturous trip, Teevault wasted no time in establishing himself. The Willamette Valley was a fledgling territory, and Oregon City a trading post to the Hudson's Bay Company, a growing community that welcomed new leaders, legislatures, and lawyers. Within the year, Teevault was admitted to the Oregon Territory Bar and began his law practice, much of which centered on divorce cases. He soon became the first prosecuting attorney for Clackamas County. His legal practice led to politics, and he was elected to the second session of the Provisional Legislature, where he was appointed to the Rules Committee. He subsequently served on the Judiciary, Post Office, and Education committees before being appointed Clerk of the House with a salary of $300. Although that position prevented his serving on other committees, he came out in favor of legislative control of spirits, and he made speeches advocating prohibition. It was a popular issue, and Teevault was a politician, even though he was also known to be a periodic drunk. In 1846, Teevault was also appointed Postmaster General for the territory and named president of the Oregon Printing Association. The latter had been established to provide a newspaper for the new territory. With little, if any, newspaper experience, Teevault was hired as the editor of Oregon's first newspaper, The Spectator. However, Teevault's editorship was extremely short-lived, from January 1st, 1846 to March 5th, 1846. The Oregon Printing Association had decreed that the paper was to be totally objective and express no political preferences. Teevault was unable or unwilling to keep his political opinions to himself, advocating Jeffersonian democracy and lauding Andrew Jackson. He was summarily dismissed. But rather than citing his political stances, the association board declared him unqualified, citing bad syntax, poor spelling, and a lack of familiarity with the territory. About the same time, Teevault gave up his position as Postmaster General, finding it a less than lucrative enterprise. But he did continue his legal practice in partnership with Sam Thurston, a less than savory character. Teevault and Thurston were retained by Dr. John McLaughlin to establish a donation land claim on his behalf. McLaughlin, superintendent of the Hudson Bay Company Columbia District, had severed his connections with the company and renounced his British citizenship to become an American. McLaughlin was already in possession of significant Hudson Bay Company acreage, which he desired to retain. However, since Oregon was still a territory and McLaughlin was not already a U.S. citizen, he was not eligible to file a land claim. It seems that instead of pursuing McLaughlin's land claim, and each partner went about trying to defraud him. Prominent pioneer Jesse Applegate heard the scheme and counseled McLaughlin to dismiss his legal advisors. After Thurston pursued the matter, Teevault broke off the partnership. Teevault may have gotten religion and become conscious of his sinful nature. He joined the congregation of Reverend George Gary III, confessing to being an adulterer, a gambler, a hard drinker, and a scoundrel. He began attending prayer meetings, and for the first half of 1847, he was an ardent church attendee. However, like previous pursuits, that proved to be short-lived when opportunities for new versions of himself soon appeared. In 1850, when Oregon's territorial governor, General Joseph Lane, decided to try his hand at mining for gold in Northern California, he invited Teevault to join the venture. A party of 15 white men and 14 Klickitat Indians headed south to the Klamath River. A temporary treaty en route with the Tekelmas proved successful. The gold panning less so, and the party returned to Oregon City. But having led an ill-fated wagon train partway across the Oregon Trail and traveled to Wairika a few times, Teevault now touted himself as an experienced guide. The experience part, however, reflected more ego than knowledge. In 1851, he was hired by Major Phil Kearney to move his troops of mounted riflemen from Fort Vancouver to Missouri by way of Fort Benicia in California. The treaty with the Tekelmas had not held, and the troops found themselves in an unsuccessful 4-day battle near what is now Shady Cove. Intervention by Territorial Governor Gaines allowed Kearney's troops to proceed and save Teevault's bacon. He parted ways with the troops at Fort Benicia and returned to Oregon City. In August of that same year, Teevault's services as a good practical mountaineer and Indian fighter were hired to find a route, if one existed, for a road from Port Orford up the Rogue River Canyon, where it could link to the California-Oregon Trail and access to the Northern California gold mines. In the early fall, he set out from Port Orford with a company of 25 men and a train of pack animals. For the first time, Teevault was relying on his own resources. He assumed that the distance from the ocean to the Rogue Valley would only be about 40 miles, and he struck out in what proved to be a senseless manner, paying no attention to mountain ridges and the natural direction of streams. He would lead his men to a mountaintop, plunge over the crest, down the slope to the bottom, and then back up the next elevation, slashing through heavy underbrush, but with no consistent pattern. He proved unable to identify any of the mountains or prominent landmarks. After 8 days, rations were running out, and Teevault's ineptitude well apparent. Despite the offer of $50 to every man who would stay with the party, only 10 chose to do so. The remaining individuals, though, weakened by hunger, soldiered on. Let's just say that the rest of the trip did not go well. Specific details vary by individual account. In brief, the men followed an Indian trail through rough mountainous country with Teevault anticipating it would lead them to the Hudson Bay Company trading post and on the Umpqua River. However, their sense of direction was inaccurate. Weak, starving, with clothes in tatters, they eventually found a branch of the Coquille River, along with Coquille Indians. Too weak to travel much further, Teevault's party decided to return to the coast. They hired the Coquille guides to take them downriver in their canoes, paying for their services with many of their remaining clothes. The Coquille showed no significant signs of hostility until the party was within 2 miles of the ocean. At that point, their Coquille guides refused to go any further. Teevault, overcome by fatigue and hunger, and induced by an onshore display of salmon at a large Indian rancheria, persuaded the majority of the party to put into shore. Big mistake. Teevault's company soon found its beached canoes surrounded by 150 hostile Coquille. 5 men were killed, 3 escaped. Teevault and one of his men, Gilbert Brush, managed to claim a canoe and paddle to the opposite shore, unnoticed in the chaos of battle. Stripping off their outer clothes so they could move more freely, they ran into the thick undergrowth where Brush, suffering a severe head wound, lapsed into unconsciousness. Teevault, seeking to save his own hide, abandoned Brush and headed for the coast. An encounter with another group of Indians relieved him with the rest of his underwear. Teevault arrived back in Fort Orford wearing only his birthday suit. Brush managed to stagger in 3 days later. In an account to the Indian agent in local newspapers, Teevault left out a few facts and described himself mainly in heroic terms. He even wrote to General Lane describing his prospects as in the ascendancy. His surviving companions were less charitable. Let's just say that this adventure of Teevault's effectively ended his career as a guide and may have also had something to do with his decision to move his family to Southern Oregon. But still certain that Port Orford would be the gateway to the mines in Northern California, Teevault planned to establish a general store and trading post there and purchase merchandise and stock to outfit it. Then word reached him of the discovery of gold in the Jacksonville area. One direction was as good as another for Teevault. Ever the opportunist, he canceled his orders for stock and supplies and headed with his family for Rich Gulch. Teevault thought to try his hand again at mining, but as he neared Jacksonville, he learned that nuggets had just been found in the area where Gull Hill would later be established. Stopping at a spring on the south bank of the Rogue River, he surveyed the clear bubbling water and the strip of green land nestled against the hills and decided that he had reached his destination. He proceeded to file a donation land claim for 210 acres and named it Dardanelles. The rationale or source of that name is unknown. It's possible that it honored Teevault's mother, who was born in Turkey, but the terrain supposedly resembled that country's Dardanelles region. Or the land may have originally been occupied by the Hudson Bay Company trappers who called it Fort Dardanelles. Or it may have been named after Dardanelle, Arkansas, where Teevault had experienced early success. Although gold may have been Southern Oregon's attraction, mining required too much time, concentration, and patience for Teevault. What with hours spent digging in creeks and washing out pans of mud, when hundreds of miners appeared in the area virtually overnight, he soon realized their pockets were a better source of gold than creek beds. He established Teevault and Company's Oregon and Shasta Express and Postal Service, providing services between Oregon City, Winchester, the Rogue River Indian Agency, Josephine Creek, Minersville, Hamburg City, and Shasta Butte City, now Wairika. And although he had not deemed postmaster for the Oregon Territory sufficiently lucrative, by December 1852, he had secured the position of first postmaster in Southern Oregon, the third in the entire state. Since the post office operated out of Teevault's home, overhead was minimal. There are two different versions of the next Teevault story, one occurring in a mining camp while riding its express route, one occurring at the October 1852 bachelor party for Nat Dean, Jackson County's first groom. In both versions, sundry drinks had made Teevault very lively. Indians had been committing deviltry in the neighborhood, and Teevault proposed reprisal. With an Arkansas yell, he began a war dance, squatting, pirouetting, waltzing, and jumping, while stripping off most of his clothes. Spying an iron kettle, Teevault decided it would add to his warlike appearance and provide a grand climax to his dance. It certainly did. It took only a moment to thrust it over his head, but in his frenzied exhibition, the pot slipped over his head and neck. Removing it was a different story entirely. Attempts to pull it off were unsuccessful. One person tried freeing it with an axe, at which point Teevault asked for pen and paper to write his dying speech. Teevault had always held himself in high esteem, but when a blacksmith was finally located, who used the tools of his trade to free our subject, Teevault emerged with an even more swollen head. As tensions between Native Americans and white settlers escalated, open warfare soon broke out all over the Rogue River Valley. Settlements were threatened and homesteaders were in terror. They took refuge in forts where there was safety in numbers. Teevault's home was quickly turned into a fortification. A stockade was erected around it, and though lacking any creature comforts, it became a refuge for neighbors. In 1853, Teevault joined his friend General Joseph Lane as an aide, fighting in one of Southern Indians' first rogue Indian wars. Teevault was put in charge of a division, but firsthand accounts of his battle failed to mention him. He must have done his share of shooting, however, because he was among the wounded. A musket ball passed through his hand, resulting in permanent partial paralysis. A contemporary of Captain William Tishner states in his reminiscences, Teevault's reputation as an Indian fighter is both good and bad. In some cases, he conducted himself with skill and courage, and it is reported in others he was cowardly and stupid. Let's just say that Teevault had his strengths and weaknesses. Experienced explorer and master soldier were not among his strengths. An 1853 peace treaty held for a while. The local tribes were inclined to honor it. The miners and settlers were not. Their goal was extermination of the Indians. Even elders, women, and children were victims of murderous attacks. After a brief respite, the wars began again. During this period, Teevault leased out his farm and moved his family to Jacksonville, although his Dardanelles home remained a functioning fort for soldiers and volunteers. Teevault resumed his law practice, and in 1854, when Jackson County was included in the Oregon Judicial District, He ran for and was elected the first prosecuting attorney. For his services, he received a handsome amount of $300 a year. And in 1855, in partnership with Alex Blakely and Sylvester Taylor, Teevault established Jacksonville's first newspaper, the Table Rock Sentinel. Although Taylor had years of experience in journalism, Teevault, with his 2 months' experience as editor of The Spectator, became editor-in-chief. Volume 1, number 1 of the Table Rock Sentinel was published on September 24th, 1855. Soon after, Teevault bought out Taylor and Blakely's shares in the paper and became sole owner. In March of 1856, with the Rogue River Indian Wars at their height, Teevault received orders to raise 3 new militia companies. He chose to interpret the orders as enrolling and mustering, neither of which involved him fighting. Yet when command was given to someone else, he voiced his displeasure in a letter to the Adjutant General. Having had it both ways, if you will, he covered the wars from a safe distance. So what kind of editor was Teevault? A critic noted, Colonel Teevault is known as the first editor in Oregon. He is not known as its best. However, the paper itself resembled other publications of the time. National news was lifted word for word from Eastern papers, but when it came time to local news, the idea of libel did not even exist. Political contests in particular were open season with no holds barred. Vitriol and name-calling were the norm. Teevault spoke for the Democratic Party of the time, voicing often and eloquently support for slavery and the Southern cause. Having spent his boyhood in Tennessee, he had been thoroughly indoctrinated. He wrote, "If I had one drop of abolitionist blood in my veins, I would cut it out." In 1852, Teevault Sentinel became the second newspaper to advocate for the introduction of slavery into what would become the new state of Oregon. Although by an overwhelming vote, the people disagreed, and slavery was not incorporated into Oregon's constitution. In 1858, Teevault was elected Jackson County representative to Oregon's territorial legislature and was named Speaker of the House on the first ballot. He reportedly conducted legislative affairs in a capable manner. In his first year, he introduced a resolution asking the Oregon delegation in the U.S. Capitol to use their influence to establish a military post at Klamath Lake with an agent in residence to serve the Klamath Indians. He also introduced a memorial to Congress asking that a mail route be adopted that would afford tri-weekly mail service between Portland and Wairika. It's possible he had in mind securing a lucrative contract and reviving his stage line, but the measure attracted little support. Teevault also nagged the legislature to pass a law that would permit slave owners to bring their slaves into the Oregon Territory. He declared, any citizen of a slaveholding state must be allowed to convey his chattel property to the Oregon Territory and be protected in his rights to hold his property. The Constitution authorizes the holding of slaves in all territories, and the legislature cannot prohibit slavery. To dedicate his time to his political interests, Teevault named one of his employees, William J. Robinson, editor of the Sentinel in his stead, at the same time changing the name of the newspaper from the Table Rock Sentinel to the Oregon Sentinel. Robinson was known to be a sound, reliable, pro-slavery Democrat. In the fall of 1859, Teevault sold his interest in the paper to James O'Meara, who continued the paper's pro-Southern policy. But in 1861, the paper was sold to Henry Dellinger and W.M. Hand, who were strongly Republican. Teevault pursued his law practice. As the Civil War started, Teevault became active in the movement to establish a Pacific Republic, the predecessor of the State of Jefferson movement. It advocating dividing the United States into 3 separate states. The citizens would live like Southern gentlemen, with all labor being performed by Chinese, Africans, Samoans, Hawaiians, working servants without the benefit of citizenship. No doubt the proposed workers would jump at the opportunity to become slaves. At least part of Teevault's political ascendancy may have been attributed to his association with Joseph Lane. Lane, the first governor of the Oregon Territory, was also a Southerner, born in North Carolina and raised in Kentucky. He had immigrated to Indiana, where he became prominent in politics, and where Lane and Teevault had both served in the state legislature. Lane served as Oregon's territorial delegate to Congress and as the state's first U.S. senator. He also ran unsuccessfully for president in 1852 and for vice president in 1860. Defeated in his bid for vice president on the Breckinridge ticket, Lane returned to Oregon on the same ship that carried the news of the attack on and surrender of Fort Sumter. Among Lane's baggage were boxes of rifles, which he planned to deliver to Jacksonville, and with Teevault's help, and Southern Oregons who were sympathetic to the Confederate cause, Lane hired an Irish teamster to deliver the crates and joined him on the wagon seat. Just as they were reaching Jesse Applegate's home in Yoncalla, the driver's pistol accidentally discharged, wounding Lane. While convalescing at Applegate's home, Applegate talked Lane out of continuing on to Jacksonville and into giving up his rash plan. However, Lane did not give up on the Pacific Republic. He became an advisor to the Knights of the Golden Circle. 800 armed knights were to capture the arsenal at Fort Benicia. Fortunately, their plan was exposed at the last minute and the movement defeated. After both the Washington Territory Legislature and the Oregon Legislature repudiated the Pacific Republic, Lane's star faded. Meanwhile, the West Coast secessionist plans had come to the attention of the federal government. Union troops established Fort Baker near Phoenix to keep an eye on and prevent undercover opposition to the Union cause. Teevault was one of the individuals under surveillance. Having sold the Sentinel, though, Teevault lacked a bully pulpit to espouse his views or defend himself. In 1862, he started a new Jacksonville newspaper, the Oregon Intelligencer, declaring himself a Union-loving man and his platform to be the Constitution of the United States. Despite what he proclaimed, Teevault continued to denounce the government and promote the Confederate cause. He seasoned his paper's pages with accusations and slander against his rivals, name-calling the now Republican-leaning Sentinel. It became Sent in Hell, and vicious attacks on Indians and Chinese. Of course, rival editors replied in kind. When a rumor circulated that Teevault had drowned, the editor of Salem's Oregon Statesman declared it an impossibility, writing, "A man born to be hung can't be drowned." The Intelligencer lasted a little over a year, folding in 1864. Walla Walla, Washington's Statesman, wrote one of its obituaries. Teevault's Jacksonville Intelligencer is dead. Complaint is supposed to be whiskey on the editor's brain. I should note that whiskey on that editor's brain, along with various escapades, support the contention that Teevault was a periodic drunk. Newspaper accounts over the years reported his being gutted in a saloon fight. He survived. Shooting a man in the back while drunk, brawling in a lager beer saloon, and more. When his latest newspaper folded, Teevault returned to law. I'm missing something here. There we go. Teevault returned to law. But his attention span was short-lived. In 1866, he was struck with Idaho fever and headed for the new mines in Silver City. At this time, probably too old to prospect, but wanting to be where the action was, he published the Idaho Index for the next year before returning to his family. In 1867, Teevault renounced his law practice and was again elected district attorney to the first U.S. First Judicial District of Oregon. The Oregon Sentinel acknowledged that under Teevault, any criminals would feel the heavy hand of the law. It also pointed out that Oregon did not require candidates to be lawyers to be eligible for the office, and that Teevault had never been admitted to any practice in any court in Oregon. After about 2 decades, Teevault began thinking about his immortal soul. It seems that General Lane did so at the same time. Perhaps they'd been in communication. At any rate, this reformation was noteworthy enough for the Oregon Sentinel to print the following. Colonel Teevault and General Lane have both professed religion and joined the Catholic Church. The old sinners have deceived the people and been obedient servants of the devil all their lives, but now in their dotage, they're both trying to cheat the devil out of his just rights. General Lane has been so strongly impressed with Catholicism that he has been remarried to his wife. Colonel Teevault ought to follow suit. It is meet for such worthies to float together, and there should be no bastards in the royal families. Perhaps Teevault had had a premonition. He was the last victim of Jacksonville's 1868-1869 smallpox epidemic. Dying in February, Father Francis Xavier Blanchette performed the last sacrament. According to the Chronicles of the Sisters of the Holy Name of Jesus and Mary, a few minutes before his death, Teevault said, "I have faced the enemy on the battlefield. I've occupied positions of honor in my country. And now must I die of smallpox?" He was 62 years old. So where does that leave us? Teevault's influence on Oregon history is difficult to determine, but he had an uncanny ability to be first on the scene, and his record is significant. He was the first editor of the first Oregon newspaper. He was Jacksonville's first newspaper editor and publisher. He was the first to attempt an overland route from Port Orford to Jacksonville. He was the first Postmaster General in the Oregon Territory. He was the first Speaker of the House of the first state legislature. If the winner is who gets there first, then Teevault earned bravos and ribbons. And there is a coda to Teevault's story. His wife, Rhoda, outlived him by almost 17 years, claiming to be Daniel Boone's granddaughter. The Southern Oregon Pioneer Society lauded her as such, even though she actually descended from Virginia's Isle of Wight County Boone family, which was no relation. And in 1943, a World War II Liberty ship was christened the William G. Teevault. Thank you.